I do indeed, Carol. And Secretary Sebelius, Governor Sebelius, just teed us up so nicely for our next conversation, alluding to this global nature for sure. So let's bring in now David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, of course, former Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom. He joins me from Connecticut. David, nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Jason. Glad you're well.
Thank you, and I trust you're well and your family too. I know you are thinking about this, obviously, given your job on quite the global scale. What's the thing we are missing about this pandemic beyond our borders here in the United States?
I think we're missing the real threat to life and livelihood for literally tens of millions of people who have no prospect of the kind of health facilities that exist in the United States, but also for whom the idea of quote unquote social distancing just isn't possible. Obviously, the population density in New York is severe, 10,000 people per square kilometer. We know that refugees, 1 million refugees in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh from Myanmar, their density is about 40 to 70,000 people per square kilometer. We know that in northwest Syria, a war zone that's been in the news certainly last month, the population densities are also several times the New York levels. And so organizations like the International Rescue Committee, which works in 200 war zones and refugee hosting states around the world, we are battling to do some very basic prevention because we know that once the disease becomes seeded, it will run rampage in very vulnerable communities.
And what are you seeing? Your folks are on the ground all across the world, and one of the most interesting and candidly frightening when you look at the data, it sounds like, is Africa, where we have not seen, and keep me honest here, a huge number of cases, but that feels like a haven't seen them yet. What do we expect there?
You're absolutely right. There's less than 10,000 recorded cases in Africa so far, but obviously there are many more than that. Having said that, we operate in 18 African countries, and we haven't yet seen the rampage, the surge that might be expected. That's partly, I think, explained by the youth of the population. It's a more youthful population, and we know from advanced industrialized countries like the US that the young people are better protected from this. But I fear that it's a matter of time. And that's why our emphasis is so much on the hand washing, the basic hand washing facilities that are possible, the fever testing that is possible, the even basic isolation centers for people who do have a fever and might have COVID. We're not going to be able to rush masses of ventilators into South Sudan. There are 4 ventilators in the whole of South Sudan for a population of 10.5, 11 million people. But we have no excuse for not doing the basics to try and prevent the spread of the disease. And also, frankly, to take on one of the biggest scourges, which is fake news. We have to use our role as trusted intermediaries because we hire local people to get the facts across, because a lack of information is a massive issue in the places where we work.
So I want to put up a poll question that's going to lead us into the next part of our discussion, very much on the news, and it's about the WHO. Let's pull that up if we can. I'm just playing with my screen here. Obviously, the big news was the President of the United States halting funding for the World Health Organization, and it's a pretty simple question. Do you think the U.S. should halt funding for the World Health Organization? It's the right thing. For various reasons, you're seeing that it's the right thing. The WHO failed. It's the right thing. America should focus on its own funds. The WHO may have failed the world, but a halt on funds endangers the U.S. It's the wrong move. I have a feeling I know where people are going to end up on this. From your perspective, David, both in your current job and also as a former government official, what's your read on this decision? How or what is the net effect of both the actual pulling of funding, but also the message that it may send?
I think you're right to see this in 2 dimensions. First of all, what's the health impact? And secondly, what's the political impact? Look, US money goes to fund, 27% of the US money goes to fund polio eradication. 17% of the money goes to fund vaccines and nutrition work. So the danger of this decision, if the review leads to a genuine cut in funding, is that it's a death sentence for some of the most vulnerable people in the world. The people who will pay the price are not those who the administration holds responsible for the failings in respect of COVID. It will be very poor people in very poor parts of the world, because American money is a lifesaver. The second aspect of this, obviously, is about international leadership. And there is a real danger that the lesson of this crisis is that America and the Western world can't cope, and that America and the Western world is giving up its leadership role. And you know that China is on a major PR, public relations offensive in respect of this. It's viewing the vacuum in international politics, and it is seeing opportunity. And so I think there is geopolitics in this decision, as well as a real health danger. And I hope that your poll results, it looks like they do,
Yes.
people have seen sense, because there is real short-sightedness if this review leads to the kind of cuts that are being heralded.
Right. Yeah. No. Overwhelmingly, people saying wrong decision. So we'll see whether the government is listening to our audience and others. Certainly, I mean, you've seen a fairly swift and I think it's fair to say bipartisan reaction against that potential pulling of funding. I have to ask you, speaking of geopolitics, having served at a high level of government, dealing with governments all around the world, David, I wonder what you make of Europe's response specifically, because it feels like there has been a divergence depending on where you look. What have we learned, and what can the rest of the world learn, especially when it comes to the more vulnerable populations, about what works and what doesn't in fighting this virus?
Well, I think there are two very striking things, three very striking things, in fact. One, you've mentioned a diversity of response from different European countries. Secondly, the strength of the European safety net, stronger than in the US, fewer holes than in the US, leads organizations like JP Morgan in their economic impact assessment to say that European countries will suffer less than the US, which I think is very striking. The third thing is that the European Union has historically had very little role in public health. And so the pan-European response has been weak. The European Union has been playing catch up. But you're seeing in the agenda for the virtual summit, which I think is happening today and tomorrow in the European Union, among the 27 European leaders, that they're trying to play that catch up game fast. Now, obviously, it's very striking that Germany has come through this very strongly. They did not go in for the denialism that seems to have been present in the US, the UK. They didn't stick their heads in the sand. They took early measures. They get their testing up to 50,000 people a day very early on, 350,000 a week. And it looks like Germany is both containing the number of cases and containing the number of deaths. And I think that gives lie to the idea that it's only the autocratic countries that are doing well out of this crisis. It's not true. Some democracies are doing badly, but some are doing well too. And I think it's very important that we now get the ballast of a European Union-wide economic and social response, because countries like Italy really need the help.
And so, and this is a question in several variations that's coming through in our audience Q&A, which is essentially, as we think about this across the rest of the world, um, as you're talking to heads of state, as you're talking to various leaders around the world, how much do you worry about the role of NGOs or the diversion of funds that might normally go to refugee crises or other work that you're so involved in? How much do you worry about the world sort of getting distracted by this crisis and maybe ignoring other crises, even knowing and conceding every crisis it feels like is somehow interlaced at this moment?
Well, I think there's a very important point that you're raising there. The old problems don't go away because we've got this massive new problem. In fact, the old problems, in some ways, the lack of universal health coverage, the weakness of the global anti-poverty regime, the tragedy of the trauma of acute malnutrition among 50 million under fives around the world. Those problems are in danger of being augmented, of being grown, of being expanded by the COVID crisis, both because COVID is a force multiplier when it comes to poverty, but also because the world turns inwards, or if the world turns inwards. And I think there's a real contest. I've actually written about this in a UK magazine, The New Statesman, which people can read today, about 4 contests that are going to define the post-COVID world. One of them is about internationalism versus nationalism. One of them is about equality and inequality. But it's also absolutely central that the world has to address the contest over how it fixes its global responsibilities. Because to my mind, COVID is a disease of the global community. It's a disease of the connected world. And it requires us to think, yes, about the acute local problems that exist in New York or anywhere else in the United States, but also are global. And we're not going to return to normality until those global problems are addressed, as well as the local problems.
So, from an optimistic standpoint, and I brought this up with the mayor of Chicago earlier, and Rahm Emanuel, a person I know, when he was President Obama's chief of staff, said never waste a good crisis. That sometimes there is an opportunity to reset, and I appreciate, I think, knowing you a little bit, knowing your work well, and it was funny when I was preparing for this. I recalled seeing a great 60 Minutes piece about the work that you're doing with Sesame Workshop, with refugee children. And I do wonder, in this age where we are thinking more about our humanity, is there an opportunity? I'm trying to give us some hope here at the end that maybe we are resetting as humans, and maybe we are thinking about the more vulnerable among our populations, because this has brought to bear things that we know were out there, but maybe it wasn't so much in our face for a long time.
Well, look, I think it's a contest, and here history can be our guide. I mean, the contest is between the reaction that we saw after the First World War and the reaction that we saw after the Second World War. After the First World War, we tragically failed to learn the lessons, and we laid the foundations for what became the Second World War. Nations turned inward. There was a failure of the League of Nations, which after all was vetoed in the US Senate, and the international order collapsed. After the Second World War, the lessons of the interwar period were learned, and global institutions were established. Global rights for individuals as well as states were set out in international law, and there was the foundations laid for the most sustained period of peace and prosperity the world has ever known. Now, I don't hide at all the traumas of the Cold War. It would be madness to forget all of the problems that existed in the post-Second World War period. But it marked a period of lesson learning of a really profound kind. And if you want an optimistic view of the future, you've got to say that this crisis needs to lead to the kind of lesson learning that happened after the Second World War, not that which happened after the First World War. And I think the lessons are stark. They start with the origins of the crisis, about how countries cover up information, but they also then go to holes in the global safety net, never mind the national safety net, that have exacerbated the damage of the disease and will prolong the extent of its economic and social consequences. And so that's the optimistic way of thinking about this, that human beings should be rational and that we've got work to do.
So, last question for you, David, before I let you get on to the very important work that you're doing. And I know that this is something you face all the time, and I think you and I have talked about it before. A lot of refugee crises seem so far away to us. And obviously, even in the midst of all of this, we are very self-focused, and that's who we are as human beings. When you think about the rest of the world, and we are reminded how interconnected we are, what's your best advice for how we don't lose sight of the rest of the world? What can we do to make sure that that stays top of mind?
Well, in the United States, to a US audience, there's a pretty simple answer to that. You just look around you. We've launched a website for the 160,000 refugees and immigrants who have medical qualifications from other countries but aren't yet working in the United States. It's called refugees.rescue.org. Look around you, Americans. There are people here who are refugees, who are immigrants, who have that background in their family, and they're ready to be mobilized for this fight for America's benefit. And America's strength has historically come from the fact that it's been open to the world, not closed to the world. And so I think that the local issues that we face here, I'm speaking to you from Connecticut, they're all across the US. Life is a team sport, and we're going to have to pull together. But there's also a global team here, and that's the message, I think, of this crisis.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. David Miliband, thank you so much. Really good to spend some
Thank
time
you.
with you, albeit virtually. Hope to do it again in person before too long when the world at least figures out what this new normal looks like. David Miliband, of course, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, joining me from Connecticut.